Hello, I'm going to talk to you a bit about Lecture 5, Socialization and Social Interaction. You've seen the study guide, I hope, by now. If you have not, it's posted on the homepage. So in any case, you know the question pool from which I will have taken 30 questions for the exam. You'll have plenty of time to consider it. Remember, it's closed note, closed book, so learn the material in the study guide question. I suggest we're just writing it down and studying that. Writing it down often is, gives you a more lasting memory of something than simply reading it. So this lecture won't be that long, I hope. So I'm going to share my screen and we will move on to the lecture once I open it. Well, I think I'm going to have to decide to share the screen first and then open it. All right, that ought to do it. Okay, the usual decorations. You should be able to figure out what's going on here after I go through the lecture, so I won't tarry on this slide. The nature and nurture debate's been going on quite a while between psychologists, sociologists, biologists, anthropologists. Nature, in this context, refers to our biological inheritance, genetic tendencies. Nurture, our social environment, upbringing, and such as that. So just wanted to let you know what that term means if you ever hear it. Both are important. It's not nature or nurture, it's both. But our biological inheritance, our genes, they kind of set the range on what we can be. But there's a very wide range. There's a lot of possibilities, a lot of potential in that range that can be enhanced or repressed as a result of cultural and environmental and social factors. Okay, you've already heard me mention in talking about symbolic interaction that part of, the core of their ideas is that the self, our sense of ourselves, our identity, which is our sense of ourselves as a unique being, to a certain extent, a sense of ourselves as an object, if we wish to view ourselves from outside ourselves, develops through interaction with others. The reactions of others provide us with some information on how they are perceiving our behavior or our appearance or whatever it happens to be. And typically we react unconsciously or consciously to that feedback from others. Cooley called it the looking glass self, a mirror. They mirror. We see who we are by looking at the mirror that other people create. And we interact differently with different groups. Those who are close to us, often we behave differently than someone, for instance, an employer or co-workers or other people in a religious body that we attend. So one way that we, interpret what others think of us is by looking at the body language and facial expression. Some facial expressions seem to be near universal. There have been some studies, for instance, by anthropologists who have exposed people of different cultures that have never had much of any contact with Western nations or beliefs. You ask them to smell something that smells bad. Everyone in every culture shows the same sort of a facial expression. There are many others. Body language is much more variable. So while you can read facial expression fairly well, especially if it's another member of your culture, um, body language is a more ambiguous area of communication. Um, there are different gender differences. For instance, women will hold eye contact in a conversation with someone, or especially someone they don't know well, longer than a man will. So there, if you're interested in this, there's multiple publications that go way deep into this, and I'm not going to. So, Looking Glass Self, I just mentioned Charles Horton Cooley. One of his sayings was, "The imagination people have of one another are the solid facts of society." It's in our minds, our imagination. That is what society is. What we believe other people mean when they are doing or saying something, and what we mean by by the social action we take. Social action that it takes into account, takes regard of others, at least one other person. George Herbert Mead is considered the founder of symbolic interactionism, although he didn't call it that. He was a philosopher at the University of Michigan or Yale, I'm not sure which, could have been both. He was a philosopher of the pragmatist school. Pragmatism is an American philosophical contribution. For the pragmatist, what is true is what works. It's not something abstract and in another realm of existence, as it was for some of the ancient Greeks, like Plato, that the real world existed elsewhere, and we only inhabited a poor replica of it. So, Mead had some ideas about how one develops a sense of self, who they are, the unique being. The self is defined by various textbooks. The ability that develops over time to take oneself, to consider oneself as an object by taking the role of another, the role of the other, role taking. Mead felt we had two sides of the self. One he called the I, and that is our natural, unconscious, creative self, unaffected by the social judgments of others that we pick up through interaction. Whereas the me is our unconscious summary of what other people think of us. We internalize that as the expectations others have of us and how we should behave. They're two different things for me. There's also the generalized other. This other that one takes the perspective of to evaluate oneself as an object, he called the generalized other. It represents the community of attitudes, the opinion, a distillation of the opinion of the entire social group. And you react and adjust your behavior, perhaps, or in terms of how you believe this generalized other is judging you. So, the symbolic aspect of symbolic interactionism. Symbols are just simply something whose meaning is understood more or less the same way by a particular group. Other groups might see it differently. So Mead wrote a lot about symbolic communication and how human beings are able to communicate symbolically, whereas other animals, non-human animals, are not. That's not completely true. We'll leave it at that. Mead felt there are two stages in the development of the self, two key stages. These aren't the only stages: the play stage and the game stage. In the play stage, the person is taking the role of another. But this other that they are playing the role of is typically their parents. They're just mimicking their parents' behavior. So you might see two girls having a tea party or two boys pretending they're doing some sort of job back in the 50s when women stayed home and raised children and then went out to earn money. So you're just mimicking someone else. But later you go through developments he called the game stage. This is more complex interaction. This is when you begin to truly take the role of a wide range of others, so that you know how everybody is the role everyone is playing and what it means for you. An example, the classic example, you think of a baseball team. Each of the baseball players has a different function, but every player has to understand what those other players are doing or are likely to do in any given situation in order to be a successful baseball player. I learned when I was forced to play baseball in elementary school, 4th, 5th grade. It's also important to have a pair of glasses with a recent prescription. Someone like me who had progressive myopia and only got glasses when the school year began had poor vision in August. It's not good for an outfielder to have poor vision. You need to be able to track the ball in order to get to the place where you're most likely to catch it. I was unable to do that for reasons of a biological deficiency that I had no control over. So, okay. Marx would have said, that the driver of history and of human behavior at a macro level is class conflict, the conflict between those who own or control resources and those who do not. Mead would say that what drives human behavior, the main source of motivation, is our need for a positive sense of self. We want to feel good about ourselves. We want to know that others believe we are a good person in general. So, Freud's going to tell us that what motivates people is sex and power. So, there are a number of motivations possible. Let me just turn off this phone call. Okay. Moving on. I just mentioned the I and the me. In a consumer society, it's expensive to keep the me aligned with what others expect. You have to wear the right clothing. You can't be out of style. It's especially traumatic for middle school students, high school students as well, and later into life. So it's not strictly just the younger students, but you have to spend a lot of time seeing what others are wearing. You don't necessarily want to stand out as being behind the times or not keeping up. Or maybe you do. There are those who do. I covered this in this meeting on theory, but again, symbolic interactionists believe social action is based on the meanings things have. And you learn the meanings of things, this could be physical things or behaviors, from interaction with others. These meanings are not fixed. They can vary between groups over the course of time. They're our thing. We create them. We determine what things mean. So I probably also mentioned Mead never wrote a book or a paper in his life. The only reason we know anything about his ideas is that his students took very good notes and one day compiled, I believe under the leadership of Herbert Blumer, who created the term symbolic interaction, compiled it into a book called Mind, Self, and Society, which summarized his key ideas. If you can call it a summary, it's about 400 pages of text. So. I already said this. The Thomas theorem you can relate to symbolic interactionism. If men define situations as real, remember back in that day, people wrote, humans would be written men. They meant everybody, but they just thought the shorthand then was men for people. If men define situations as real, they are real in their consequences. If you believe something is true, something is how the world is, then it works that way for you. The Thomas theorem. Although you notice I put Thomas and Thomas, 1928, there's some evidence from correspondence that his spouse, Dorothy Thomas, actually came up with this formulation, or at least the core of what William I. Thomas published as the Thomas theorem. Oh my goodness, this is so noisy. Anyway, let me, going to pause this for a moment. Actually, I'm going to have to pause the recording as well. Okay, I'm back. All right. Irving Goffman, probably one of the most underrated sociologists we'll talk about. He wrote a lot. His ideas are very useful in understanding ourselves and each other, in my view. He was an American, developed a theory based on, he treated social behavior, social interaction in theatrical terms, in terms of dramaturgy. Sometimes it's called dramaturgical analysis. If you've ever been to a play and looked at the program, you've seen someone called a dramaturge, which is the person that takes the play as written by the playwright and more or less adapts it, to whatever it is the actors in the theater group he or she is working with plans to do, kind of in between the playwright and the actors. So for Goffman, our social performances are of two basic types. Those that occur in what he called the front region or the front stage, which is where we're acting the role. We're doing a performance and acting out a role that we want others to accept about us. So if you're an actor, you want to be authentic. You want to convince the audience you are that person that is represented in the play and not whoever the actor might be with their features and foibles and habits and attitudes and so forth. Backstage or back region is where you are not putting on a performance for the audience, considered society as a whole. You can relax, you can be yourself. That thing called the I, maybe for me, is in operation back there. The me is out there on the front stage, where you're performing. Backstage, you're freer to express your real thoughts. You can also, another example, or a real example, if you're a waiter in a restaurant, you're going to be very polite to the customers, regardless of whether or not you think they're wearing a funny looking hat or a shirt or happen to have spilled something on themselves they haven't noticed before they come to sit down. You're not going to say anything about that. You're going to take their order and be polite. But when you go backstage, so to speak, to the back region, to the kitchen, you may mention, hey, that guy out there that never tips, he's got some kind of big stain. It looks like, I think it's a little smelly. Tell me if I'm imagining things when you go by. You might laugh about a patron of the restaurant that has a particularly humorous habit, but you're not going to do that when you are interacting with them, obviously. So there's a front stage and a backstage. Joe Fagan, he had been the chair of the sociology department at Texas A&M. I'm not sure he still is, but he's still there. Writes a lot about racism for the most part these days. Wrote a book called Two-Faced Racism, where he interviewed college students from all over the country, from Ivy League schools down to community colleges, everything in between, and found numerous cases among white students where they present themselves as being colorblind, but backstage when they're talking with each other, they appear to have a lot of racist attitudes. So the book is called Two-Faced Racism, if you're interested in that sort of thing. So Goffman said we're always engaged in impression management whenever we're interacting with someone. We want to control what they think of us. Part of that is through the role we take in that interaction, who it is we decide to be, or what we have to be in the interaction. Sometimes we have no choice. If you're applying for a job, you need to play a certain role. You cannot take texts on your phone and and tell jokes and that sort of thing. If you are in a job interview, if you are, you can, but it's not likely you're going to get the job unless you're auditioning as a stand-up comedian or something like that. So impression management just relates to all the techniques people may use to control that image. Some of those are, one of those is audience segregation. You need to know who's around you before you begin to play your role. You don't want to be telling your friends what a great party you just had and how glad you were they were there. If someone that you've decided you don't really like, don't want coming to your parties, but haven't really shared that with them, if they are there too, you're going to wait till they're gone to talk about something like that. If you're around your grandmother, your language may not be as colorful, so to speak, as it might be if you are with your friends, or if you are angry at someone or something like that. You're going to be different. So another thing people do unconsciously, and we all do it, something he called civil inattention. It's a type of unfocused interaction. That's civil inattention is when you make yourself aware of people that are around you, but you don't really make eye contact to the extent that you might invite some sort of interaction. You're sort of ignoring them, but you know they're there. Riding an elevator with strangers is an example. Now, sometimes it's more common for people to talk, particularly if they know one another more or less, but if not at all, often people are completely silent. If you're walking down a busy street in a city, you're kind of taking in the people that are approaching you. If you sense somebody behind you, you're definitely going to try to furtively determine who that might be. It's a matter of self-preservation in many cases, but you need to know who's coming. If you're trying to avoid an ex-boyfriend, you need to keep your eyes, not focused ahead, because sometimes when you make eye contact with someone for too long, they view that as an invitation to some sort of interaction of various sorts, depending upon the group in question. So you have to learn to do this because there's no time out. This is a form of front stage in a sense. You can't necessarily be yourself anymore with strangers in an elevator or walking down the street. You are kind of in between being yourself and acting out a role. You may need to know what role to act out. You see your boss coming, you know you're going to have to interact as if you are his usual employee. Socialization, a lot of definitions here. You can read these as well as I. That's where we learn what's expected of us and how to go about accomplishing that things, what others expect of us, the rules, the norms, how things are done. That's socialization. We learn that from our parents and from our siblings, and later from peers on the playground, at elementary school, and on and on. It never ends. Freud would have said socialization, particularly sexual socialization, ends when you reach puberty and you go through certain syndromes and come to terms with them. And either you do that successfully and you're a regular human, or you don't and you develop a neurosis and then become a patient for people like Freud. Resocialization is very common now. People change jobs more often, so every workplace has a different culture, so you need to be socialized to the expectations of a new job and how people behave. I went from a fairly laid-back job setting in Harris County to a different setting in Harris County, to the forensics lab, and it was, in this place, people did not talk to one another. Laughing was more or less forbidden at this location. If I was advised not to share any issues with anybody, because they would kind of take note of it, put it in their back pocket in case they needed to use it against you, or to, convince the boss that something they did was really your fault. It was a very toxic workplace culture. Total institutions are those places where you live 24/7. Someone else controls everything that goes on. Irving Goffman studied several of those. Prisons are an example. If you're in prison, you can't decide to go to a friend's wedding. You don't take holidays to go home and visit your family. No, you eat when they say eat. You sleep when they say sleep. You get in line when they tell you. Mental hospitals are another example. We don't have mental hospitals of the type that Irving Goffman did a participant observation of, which resulted in a book called Asylums. Goffman got a job as a janitor at one of these places. These institutions were, I think I've mentioned this, well, I think that was another lecture, but used to be the case that if your family found you difficult or they had an agenda, you had inherited control of some property or a business they wanted, or just all manner of things could lead to you ending up in a court and being declared insane, not capable of making your own decisions, and you might end up in a hospital, which was not a very nice hospital. It was more or less a prison. But you had a prison sentence with no particular endpoint. You would be released when the doctors felt you were sane again, whatever that was. You would be subjected to whatever the treatments were popular that day. We'll talk about some a little later that were pretty horrifying, but here's a little video about workplace socialization. You may watch this if you like. So, total institutions, prisons, basic training in the military is an example. You're controlled. If you've seen the film Full Metal Jacket, Stanley Kubrick film dealing with the Vietnam War in a way, the first half of it is Marine Corps basic training, and that is exactly how it was at the time, according to a co-worker of mine who was a Marine drafted during the Vietnam War. The intention is to make you into a new person. You go in as one thing, you come out as something else. In the case of prison, the intention is to make you a law-abiding citizen through various techniques of rehabilitation. Generally, it doesn't work so well. In the case of a basic training in the military, it's to take someone who's barely an adult, an 18, 19-year-old, and turn them into someone who will follow whatever order their superior officer gives them. It's not natural to run onto a field where at the other side there are people and you can hear it. People are firing weapons at you. That's not natural. Our tendency, we tend to want to preserve our lives. But you're turned into a person who will do it without thinking. So another kind of resocialization is a degradation ceremony. A man named Harold Garfinkel introduced that term into sociological lexicon. And it's a similar thing. You go in as one person, you go out as another. It doesn't involve at first necessarily a total institution. Criminal trials are a good example. The claim is we are innocent till proven guilty. So you go to court and suddenly you are proven guilty. You're found guilty of a felony. You did not expect it. Suddenly you are a new person. You're a person that's being taken to a total institution. But this ceremony happened in a courtroom, which is not a total institution. People don't live there. Garfinkel also, a psychiatrist, R.D. Lang, thought that psychiatric examinations were a form of degradation ceremony. You go in as someone who may have been forced to go there, you may have chosen to go there because you're having some problems, and you're seeing a physician who's most likely going to think in terms of medical treatments for whatever problem you're presenting. And to do so and to collect money from insurance, they have to assign a diagnosis which has a particular code. And suddenly you are a person with a mental illness. And people will treat you and react to you differently if they know you are one of these folks. You don't have to advertise it. You know, it's not emblazoned. You don't, you know, wear a big name tag around your neck. It's always best not to advertise it, particularly if it's something like depression, which so many people are being treated for. And it's almost considered, oh, no big deal to be taking an antidepressant. Well, for a lot of people, it still is a big deal. You don't quite trust, there are people who won't quite trust you if they know that. So if you want to continue being asked to babysit your friends' children, don't let them know you've ever been to a psychiatrist. Because no matter how progressive and forward thinking you think people you know are, the odds are they are not. So socialization, I already mentioned, defined, begins in childhood. Freud believed it was complete around age. I didn't put the number in that. How about that? Let's say age 12. Erik Erikson thought it never ends. Well, it ends with death when we're no longer functioning as a human. An agent of socialization is whatever group or person does the socializing. It varies with circumstances. Primary socialization is carried out by parents. It's where you learn to speak, you learn the language, you learn the basic norms and customs, like how to eat with a fork or a spoon, how to blow your nose, to brush your teeth. All these things you learn from your parents. The type of socialization you go to varies with the culture your parents are from or identify with, as well as social class. It has an influence on accents, on number of other things, how you dress, how often you may bathe. Not quite, no. I'm talking about cross-culturally here as well. Parents also do something called anticipatory socialization. They tell children what's about to happen to them when they become 11 or so, when puberty is on the horizon. They want to let the children know their body's going to start changing, and here's the reason. Sometimes it's expected that the parents will tell you something about reproduction. That used to be called telling your child about the birds and the bees. In other words, something about biology. And you might not tell them about people, but about, use some other animal as an analog. Back when I was a child, most parents were very uncomfortable about this. Often it didn't happen at all. My parents made an appointment with my doctor to talk about that. And he gave me a book to read, and I read it. And suddenly I knew a lot that my classmates did not, and we were kind of amazed at some of the things, although we still didn't quite understand. The book wasn't that clear. Double consciousness is a concept introduced by W.E.B. Du Bois in a book called The Souls of Black Folk. Du Bois was the first African American to get a PhD from Harvard. He studied under Max Weber and was highly educated, a brilliant man. But he encountered racism of the 1920s and 30s after he completed his PhD and discovered he could not get a job offer, or usually not even an interview, from any but an historically black university, despite his training and his standing at the time he received his doctorate. I believe he began teaching at Morehouse in Atlanta. I'm not certain about that. But in any case, he had grown up in Massachusetts and studied at Harvard and in Europe. So his first experience of racism occurred after he became a professor at Morehouse College, and discovered that the color of his skin was all white Americans saw. That is what structured their interaction with him. Nothing else was important. This is what we would call later a master status. Despite the fact he had a PhD and was brilliant, highly educated, which is called an achieved status. Those were achievements. It was his ascribed status, these things you cannot change, that acted as the master status. Either one can be the master status, but in this case, and particularly with African Americans, your race, skin color, really, is all that is the master status. So he realized, especially for African Americans in the South, growing up, you developed a double consciousness. You were socialized by your parents, your friends, your church, people at your church. You learned, got a certain sense of self, but you also had the white community to deal with, who is seeing you completely differently. So you have to learn another way of being when you are around them. And that kind of creates a split, or a sense of two-ness, he called it, double consciousness. And it's difficult to juggle those two selves. And he believed that, this burden, it's a burden that can leave some permanent psychological scars. And white America knew nothing at all about it. So. Elijah Anderson studied socialization and interaction in an area of Philadelphia in an observational, somewhat participatory observational study in an area of Philadelphia where you had was in the historic Black community of Philadelphia, but part of this community had been where the Black middle class lived. There was a vibrant, prosperous Black middle class for a while in Philadelphia: doctors, accountants, shopkeepers in this area that did well. Philadelphia was an industrial city for quite some time until deindustrialization began to occur. Factories shut down, jobs went overseas. The jobs that disappeared were usually well-paid, often union jobs, working in the shipyards or mills of some sort, where you'd make enough money to, buy a house and support a family, buy a new car every few years. Those jobs disappeared. Often the people who had built these large old Victorian houses, the doctors and professionals of the African American middle class that lived there, passed on, left them to their children, who could not make the amount of money that once could be made in that area. So they tended to fall into disrepair because there simply wasn't enough money to keep up a big old house. They're expensive. So the prices of the housing fell. People were renting them, splitting them up into apartments, and something called gentrification began. This is where a group comes into an area that's that's seen better days. There are houses that are run down, but they're structurally pretty sound. The price is low. These buyers, who are often young, affluent professionals from the city, will come in, buy them, rehabilitate them, and make that. Suddenly they're worth a lot of money. And suddenly property values in that area begin to go up. When property values go up, taxes go up. When property taxes go up, rent goes up. People who've been living in that community for a long time could no longer afford there. They moved to the other part of the community, which was somewhat less affluent to begin with and was run down as well. And so you have these two. There was a boundary of sorts, one particular street between these two areas. And Elijah Anderson spent time observing people interacting, people, the gentrifiers, primarily whites, interacting with members of the Black community. in this area, and observing body language and facial expressions to see what kind of signals people were sending each other, because that's part of socialization and interaction as well. This, you know, seeing yourself mirrored in someone else's response. What he saw a lot of were things like if a white woman is approaching a group of young African American males, they will clutch their purse up to their body. If you see that, you can read that. She's telling you she thinks you are dangerous. She has fear. So it was so obvious that there were times when some people would say to her, no, we're not one of those people. The neighborhood, the African American neighborhood, had changed a lot as well. When, you know, there weren't many good jobs, but suddenly there was money to be made selling drugs, and it changed the nature of the culture in that part of the city for the worse. In the African American community, you often had older men who would kind of mentor younger men, called them old heads. Sometimes it was a woman, but they were puzzled by the younger generation. They knew that, you know, that telling them they should work hard, get a job and work hard when that job was at McDonald's didn't carry the same weight as when 20 years earlier the job might have been at a shipyard where you'd make $25 an hour. You had trouble reaching them. The community had changed radically. So sometimes when people send you a particular message about who they think you are, what they think you're capable of, even if it's not you, you may internalize it. There's an, you know, sometimes it's not uncommon for people to say when they discover everybody believes they have been doing something less than reputable or illegal or immoral, just say, well, I might as well do it. Everybody thinks I'm doing it. It's not uncommon, internalizing these messages. We'll skip Paul Willis. Gender socialization, I'm going to save for our talk on gender. Here's some more about total institutions. I've already really covered that. And interaction, the definition, the process by which we act and react to those around us. That's pretty abstract and straightforward. I mentioned Goffman called civil inattention unfocused. Focused interaction is like it sounds. You are engaged with someone. You're having a conversation. Unfocused civil inattention is an example. Status, I mentioned these. Achieve status, it's based on your accomplishments. Ascribe status is something you have no control over. You're born with that. It's almost like a caste, but your race you're born with, your gender you're born with. And that people can treat you differently depending upon your race, gender, or in India, your caste, although officially the caste system is no longer operable. Unofficially in the countryside, rural areas, it's still very much alive. Roles are just what's expected of a person with a particular status. How are they supposed to behave? So if you have children, you may have any of these roles. Your status is a person with children, parent, father, mother. Role conflict is where you have a contradiction between two roles. You can't do both of them. Your role performance is just playing that role. Role strain, too much is required of a single role. Sometimes role strain it leads to role conflict. If you have two roles, you're a college student and you're a caregiver for an elderly relative, they can conflict. You may not be able to do both. Role strain and role conflict could both come into play. You know, just simply being a caregiver can be too much in some cases. A role set is just an array of roles attached to that status. It's just another definition sociologists like. Social capital, your network of relationships. Who do you know? Who can help you out when you need a job? Who can help you, put in a good word for you at the bank if you need to apply for a loan? It's your extended network of friends, associates, interest groups. The more people, your social capital is basically all the people you know, really. And some of those people can help you. Okay. Robert Putnam wrote a relatively famous book not so long ago, Bowling Alone. The title comes from the fact that in the 50s and 60s, it was common for the people of the middle class to be in a bowling league, particularly moms, the mothers, the women, because it was a, it was a time out from their normal duties. Could get together and have a beer or two and bowl. If you don't know what bowling is, it's rolling a big ball down a lane and knocking over these pins. It's a social thing. You have teams, and then the teams compete with one another in these bowling leagues. And he used it as an analogy for people being interconnected in a community. Other indicators of it would be going to the Parent-Teacher Association conferences, or being involved in local politics, volunteering to work at the polls, political campaigns, going to church. Putnam found all these things have declined since the 1960s, and he advanced a few reasons. More women were working, had less time to get involved in some of the things they had been doing. People moved more often. You didn't stay in the same town your entire life. You had to change careers, and your new employer might send you to another part of the country. Family structures changed, and also we began to entertain ourselves through private channels. First it was cable TV, keeping us at home, always something new to watch, and now we have streaming and video on demand and renting. For a period, people rented video cassettes, and then they rented DVDs and Blu-rays, and now the rental agencies are pretty much limited, I think, to Redbox and Netflix's DVD.com. People don't do that so much anymore because you can stream so much. You cannot, by the way, stream every movie that exists. That's not yet possible. I'm not sure it will be possible. There are many films of historic importance that only exist on these video cassettes, these tapes. I have a handful of those. Eventually, someone may clean them up and put them on DVDs. It's hard to say. There are new restorations of old films coming out all the time. And okay, that's it. That's all I got for this. This was a quick one. You have the PDF. You've seen the questions. You know the drill. So I'm going to leave you with that. Good luck. Come to Q&A Saturday or Sunday evening, if you like. I haven't sent the invitations, but I will. Have a good Saturday.